I'm Abe Zucca. This is part 3 of Stalin and his Closed Systems of Colossus. Part 3. You can check out my website, zuccagallery.com. You can come into my gallery in downtown Phoenix at 1301 Grand Avenue. I'm a writer, painter, artist. I just finished a 8-part series of the unborn levels of Scientology, and now I'm on to Joseph Stalin. Probably what comes after this is fractal Islam and a lot of other different subjects that I don't see on YouTube. I create new genres. Don't let my low subscription, the low amount of subscribers, fool you. Google my name, Abe Zucca, check out my artwork. Let's begin. Stalin's Closed Systems of Colossus. The culture of the Stalin era, categorical axioms of aesthetic power. The world is only justified as an aesthetic phenomenon. First, one must order one's own thoughts. Books are tools, not ornaments. The aesthetic state. Every totalizing philosophy project, philosophical, political project begins as an aesthetic wager that the disorder of life may be rendered equivalent to the order of form, and that the world, like a pliable material, will submit to the hands that dare sculpt it. If you have any questions, just type it up. I'd rather not just be a boring reader, but for those that don't want to respond or inquire, they can just sit back and listen. But please ask questions. The planned society, before being an economic design, is an artwork. Its architecture, or its architect, imagines himself not merely as a ruler but as a stylist, correcting the inherited blemishes of history by imposing a unifying line across every domain. In such regimes, power and aesthetic distance converge. Criticism is dismissed not by argument, but by claiming that only the bird's eye view of authority can perceive the total composition. The revolutionary's paradox, he demands that thought be a product of social conditions, yet claims exemption from the very determination when shaping the new order. Thus, the rational core of every rationalist utopia. When Western revolutions negotiate with their past, the Russian upheaval treated tradition as an object of aesthetic disgust, an unworthy palette to be scraped clean, and a failed draft to be torn from the notebook. Backwardness became not merely an economic problem, but an aesthetic shame, and shame, when collectivized, becomes a powerful solvent of inherited forms. The avant-garde's paradox of power. The avant-garde's dream was not marginality but totality, to redesign life from the ground up. Its exile from institutions was not chosen humility, but the price of losing the contest for cultural sovereignty. To read the avant-garde as innocent victims is to romanticize them. Their aesthetic will to recognize life was structurally identical to the state's later will, differing only in scale and success. The violent purity of avant-garde's abstraction and the violent clarity of socialist realism share a common ancestor, the conviction that the world must be purged of ambiguity. Every artist who seeks to master material already rehearses the logic of political domination. The difference lies only in the reach of one's tools. The defeat of the avant-garde returns as the state's triumph. Society becomes the canvas the avant-garde once imagined, but painted in a style the artists themselves would not have chosen. Socialist realism is state form. Socialist realism was not the taste of the masses, but a pedagogy imposed upon them, didactic, monumental, and indifferent to actual desires. A doctrine developed in in perilous debates where a single rhetorical misstep could cost a life, hardened into the unchallenged grammar of official culture. What I'm reading right now is Stalin's Closed Systems of Colossus, written by me, Abe Zucca. If you have any questions further about what I'm reading, please ask them. A doctrine developed in perilous debates where a single rhetorical misstep could cost a life, hardened into the unchallengeable grammar of official culture. What appears as return to the classics was not nostalgia, but a highly constructed stylization, a classical pose without classical freedom, an academic vocabulary mobilized for political didacticism. Please subscribe. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. I have a gallery in downtown Phoenix. If you happen to be in Phoenix, Arizona, 1301 Grand Ave. Let's continue the reading. The masses were not consulted. Anything sanctified by the leadership, whether lyrical utopia or black square, would have been greeted with equal ritual enthusiasm. The key to socialist realism is not regression but extremity. It carried to completion the avant-garde's early desire for unified aesthetic life, only under the sign of authority rather than experiment. Thus, socialist realism is best understood not as failed classicism but as successful totalization, a monolithic style organizing architectural, literature, film, pedagogy, memory. Post-utopian reflection in the shadow of power. Post-Soviet culture attempts restoration, yet restoration itself becomes a new form of will to power. A canon retroactively declared authentic, policing the memory of rupture. Neo-traditionalism condemns the aesthetic ambition of avant-garde while quietly replicating its logic to prescribe forms for an entire culture under the sign of return. Art emerges on the ruins of total planning, an art that quotes power rather than opposes it, revealing that aesthetic intention and political will share deep structural affinities. Quotation becomes a method for exposing complicity. Irony becomes the medium through which artists acknowledge their entanglement with the very structures they critique. Post-utopian art, unlike its Western counterparts, confronts a state that had already enacted the avant-garde's dream of life as art. Therefore, its negativity is a recognition of kinship, not a claim to purity. I don't have any tips on becoming an author. I hardly have a fan base or a readership. I'm growing one. You're seeing one grow as he reads. The artist discovers that resistance is never innocent. Every form of critique carries residues of organizational desire, a faint echo of the command to rebuild the world. If you want to become an author, you must rebuild the world. Read some Stalin. Read some L. Ron Hubbard. Subscribe to my channel if you want to be an author. Archaeologies of cultural power. To understand totalizing aesthetic projects, one must dig not into events, but into the internal logic of their forms. Decrees are symptoms, styles are causes. The true archive of a cultural era is not its public monuments, but its boundary conditions, moments where the system strains against the limits of its own vocabulary. Thanks for the subscription. The true archive of cultural era is not its public monuments, but its boundary conditions, moments where the system strains against the limits of its own vocabulary. A culture should be read where it ruptures, where the avant-garde approaches power, where power approaches artistic form, where postmodern reflection recognizes its own inheritance. I wish I could read this a little slower, but it's just a lot of stuff. I'm trying to get through it. This is just part 3. I think I might just go a quarter way through this book and then start my other readings of Fractal Islam. Fractal Islam is my next subject. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. The historian must avoid the moral constellation of binaries, victim versus perpetrator, purity versus corruption, and instead trace how aesthetic intentions become political mechanisms. Cultural archaeology reveals that every utopia leaves behind the sediment of its aspirations as well as its violence. To interpret these layers is to confront the continuity between creation and destruction. What remains is not absolution, but clarity. that aesthetic ambition, revolutionary belief, and political ruthlessness form a single historical braid, legible only when we refuse to cut its strands apart. What remains is not absolution but clarity, that aesthetic ambition, revolutionary belief, and political ruthlessness form a single historical braid, legible only when we refuse to cut its strands apart. The next is the revolutionary meridian, axioms for understanding the Russian Revolution in the Stalinist world. To remake everything, to organize things so that everything should be new. Science offers the means to transform the social world. The revolution itself is the first great utopia. The utopian impulse and the will to remake life. Every revolution begins with a sentence before it begins with an event. A vow that life in its present state is intolerable, not merely morally or economically, but aesthetically, and must therefore be remade from the ground up. Yeah, the books are for sale. They'll be for sale soon. The Russian Revolution inherited not only the grievances of empire and war, but the entire imaginative field of European utopianism. From rational order to Marxist scientific eschatology, and sought to enact them in the material grain of the world. Before it was a doctrine, Bolshevism was a style of belief, the conviction that politics could sculpt society as the artist shapes clay, that the social body could be organized according to clarity of an idea rather than the contingency of history. Revolutionary utopianism always contains a paradox. It promises inclusivity through exclusion, rationality through improvisation, and universality through the fierce assertion of a particular class as the bearer of the universal. The utopian impulse in Russia drew its force from a long-standing national desire to match Europe with surpassing it, an ambition that paradoxically intensified as Russia recognized its backwardness. Thus, the revolution emerged as a historical conditioned merger of two aspirations that had haunted Russia for centuries: to be powerful and to be morally exemplary. Russia wasn't invited to the party. It had to make its own party. The event of 1917 and the path from implosion to mobilization. The collapse of the autocracy was not the revolution, but the opening of the stage on which revolution could be performed. The fall of the Tsar removed the conductor, but the orchestra was already tuning its instruments. Bolshevism did not win power through mastery. They won it because a state had dissolved and an armed populace demanded direction. February created freedom, October created purpose. It was a civil war, not the seizure of Winter Palace, that fused these into a coherent revolutionary identity. Revolution radiated through land seizures, factory takeovers, soldiers' mutinies, and national uprisings, a multiplicity of actions that converged into a single narrative only through retrospective Bolshevik interpretation. The Bolshevik genius was not their ideology, but their timing. They arrived with a conceptual scheme precisely when millions sought a language to articulate their disillusionment and desire. Civil war was a crucible that transformed an improvised coup into a self-conscious project of state building, converting disparate forces into institutional forms, Red Army, security apparatus, party hierarchy, capable of preserving and extending their project. The Great Break as rationalized utopia. The Great Break of 1929 was not a policy shift, but a civilizational gamble, an assertion that an agrarian empire could be industrialized at unprecedented speed through the combination of scientific planning and political coercion. This is the most important part of Stalin's closed system of Colossus. It is, could an agrarian empire be industrialized at an unprecedented speed through the combination of scientific planning and political coercion? These two, scientific planning and political coercion, industrialization was imagined not merely as an economic necessity, but as a world historical acceleration, a way of collapsing centuries of development into a single decade. The new cities, above all, were not industrial installations, but material embodiments of enlightenment rationality, the belief that social order could be engineered as confidently as steel works. The success of industrialization was not the triumph of a single leader, but the entanglement of national ambition, social mobility, utopian desire, and the welfare state logic of guaranteeing employment, housing, and security. The Great Break revived the Civil War's militant utopianism while fusing it with modern bureaucratic rationality, creating a system that was at once emotionally intoxicating and administratively disciplined. Thus, Stalinism was not a deviation from the revolution, but its second wind, a renewed promise of transcendence articulated through planning, discipline, and the transformation of the countryside. Next, we go on to social science, enlightenment, and the reason of politics. Scientific socialism. Marx was less a science than a permission structure for political re-engineering. It authorized rulers to treat society as knowable systems susceptible to intervention and acceleration. The Enlightenment's faith in rational order was intensified in Russia by the intensity of historical backwardness. Rationality became not a method, but a weapon. Subscribe, follow, check out my website, zuccagallery.com. Let's continue the reading. State, society, and the welfare power nexus. Stalinism cannot be understood as the annihilation of society, but as a creation of a new one built through new prosperity, property relations, new labor structures, new welfare entitlements, and new identities. The Soviet welfare state was not a concession, but a foundational doctrine. Employment, housing, pension, all collective services were not rights, but instruments for shaping a model citizenry. In this synthesis, coercion and welfare were two sides of the same project. Discipline ensured development, and development justified discipline. The welfare state's logic, regulation, normalization, tutelage melded seamlessly with the revolutionaries' mission. The result was a political system that was paternalistic, interventionist, and self-confidently modern. Yeah, some of them I made, some of them I didn't. Some of them were expensive books, so I had to print them up. Urbanization was the arena where the synthesis took form. Cities became laboratories in which new modes of living, working, and belonging were tested and refined. The Soviet experiments thus prefigured many features of modern governance: worldwide centralized planning, social insurance, regulation of everyday life, and the belief that the state could and should shape the citizens' inner world. The Stalinist world was made not only by decrees, but by everyday negotiations, compliances, evasions, reinventions through which ordinary people navigate the demands placed upon them. Power functioned not only through police, but through micro-practices, mutual surveillance, self-discipline, cues, and dormitories, forums, ration cards, meetings. Resistance did not require heroic acts. It existed in detours, delays, appropriations, informal exchanges, redefinitions of rules, and all of which shaped the working of systems from below. The result was a two-way struggle. The state attempted to mold subjectivity, yet subjects continually modified the state's intentions through their own pursuits of livelihood, dignity, and meaning. Foucault's insight that power produces subjects finds its clearest historical test in Stalinism. Identities are not merely oppressed, but forged. Thus, the revolution was lived not only in slogans and steel mills, but in kitchens, barracks, queues, canteens, and collective apartments, spaces where power abstractions met with density of daily life. The revolutionary meridian. What unifies this vast historical field: Enlightenment, reason, Marxian science, revolutionary violence, welfare statism, industrial modernity, and daily negotiation, is the belief that society can be consciously remade. This belief produced a civilization, one that sought not merely to govern, but to build a new human being. Stalinism was not the end of revolution or its betrayal, but its most ambitious and contradictory realization. At once emancipatory and coercive, forward-looking and brutal, rational and fervently utopian. Its legacy: planning, welfare, social engineering, urban modernity, disciplined subjectivity, shaped not only its own citizens, but the 20th century's global horizon of possibility. To understand the revolution is to grasp the tension between aspiration and coercion, between the imagined futures and material constraints, between grand design and lived improvisation. Finally, the Russian Revolution is best read not as a single event, but as a meridian, an axis of historical orientation where enlightenment, industrial capitalism, utopian desire, and geopolitical ambition intersect to produce a new world. That is this is the end of part 3 of Stalin and his closed system. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and I will see you guys later.